Chapter 10 of Mary Queen of Scots. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mary Queen of Scots by Jacob Abbott. Chapter 10. Loch Leven Castle. Grange, or as he is sometimes called, Kirkcaldy, his title in full being Grange of Kirkcaldy, was a man of integrity and honour, and he, having been the negotiator through whose intervention Mary gave herself up, felt himself bound to see that the stipulations on the part of the nobles should be honourably fulfilled. He did all in his power to protect Mary from insult on the journey, and he struck with his sword and drove away some of the populace who were addressing her with taunts and reproaches. When he found that the nobles were confining her and treating her so much more like a captive than like a queen, he remonstrated with them. They silenced him by showing him a letter, which they said had been intercepted on its way from Mary to Bothwell. It was written, they said, on the night of Mary's arrival at Edinburgh. It assured Bothwell that she retained an unaltered affection for him, that her consenting to be separated from him at Carberry Hill was a matter of mere necessity, and that she should rejoin him as soon as it was in her power to do so. This letter showed, they said, that, after all, Mary was not, as they had supposed, Bothwell's captive and victim, but that she was his accomplice and friend, and that, now that they had discovered their mistake, they must treat Mary as well as Bothwell as an enemy, and take effectual means to protect themselves from the one as well as from the other. Mary's friends maintained that this letter was a forgery. They accordingly took Mary, as has been already stated, from the Provost's house in Edinburgh down to Holyrood House, which was just without the city. This, however, was only a temporary change. That night they came into the palace, and directed Mary to rise and put on a travelling dress, which they brought her. They did not tell her where she was to go, but simply ordered her to follow them. It was midnight. They took her forth from the palace, mounted her upon a horse, and, with Ruthven and Lindsay, two of the murderers of Rizzio, for an escort, they rode away. They travelled all night, crossed the river Forth, and arrived in the morning at the castle of Loch Leven. The castle of Loch Leven is on a small island in the middle of the loch. It is nearly north from Edinburgh. The castle buildings covered at that time about one half of the island, the water coming up to the walls on three sides. On the other side was a little land, which was cultivated as a garden. The buildings enclosed a considerable area. There was a great square tower, marked on the plan below, which was the residence of the family. It consisted of 4 or 5 rooms, one over the other. The cellar, or rather what would be the cellar in other cases, was a dungeon for such prisoners as were to be kept in close confinement. The only entrance to this building was through a window in the second story, by means of a ladder which was raised and let down by a chain. This was over the point marked E on the plan. The chain was worked at a window in the story above. There were various other apartments and structures about the square, and among them there was a small octagonal tower in the corner, which consisted within of one room over another for 3 stories, and a flat roof with battlements above. In the second story there was a window, W, looking upon the water. This was the only window having an external aspect in the whole fortress, all the other openings in the exterior walls being mere loopholes and embrasures. This castle was in possession of a certain personage styled Lady Douglas. She was the mother of the Lord James, afterwards the Earl of Murray, who has figured so conspicuously in this history as Mary's half-brother, and at first her friend and counsellor, though afterwards her foe. Lady Douglas was commonly called the Lady of Loch Leven. She maintained that she had been lawfully married to James V., Mary's father, and that consequently her son, and not Mary, was the rightful heir to the crown. Of course she was Mary's natural enemy. They selected her castle as the place of Mary's confinement partly on this account, and partly on account of its inaccessible position in the midst of the waters of the lake. They delivered the captive queen, accordingly, to the Lady Douglas and her husband, charging them to keep her safely. The Lady Douglas received her, and locked her up in the octagonal tower with the window looking out upon the water. In the meantime all Scotland took sides for or against the queen. The strongest party were against her, and the Church was against her, on account of their hostility to the Catholic religion. A sort of provisional government was instituted, which assumed the management of public affairs. Mary had, however, some friends, and they soon began to assemble in order to see what could be done for her cause. Their rendezvous was at the palace of Hamilton. This palace was situated on a plain in the midst of a beautiful park, near the river Clyde, a few miles from Glasgow. The Duke of Hamilton was prominent among the supporters of the Queen, and this made his house their headquarters. They were often called, from this circumstance, the Hamilton Lords. On the other hand, the party opposed to Mary made the castle of Stirling their headquarters, because the young prince was there, in whose name they were proposing soon to assume the government. Their plan was to depose Mary, or induce her to abdicate the throne, and then make Murray regent, to govern the country in the name of the prince until the prince should become of age. During all this time Murray had been absent in France, but they now sent urgent messages to him to return. He obeyed the summons and turned his face towards Scotland. In the meantime, Mary continued in confinement in her little tower. She was not treated like a common prisoner, but had in some degree the attention due to her rank. There were 5 or 6 female and about as many male attendants, though if the rooms which are exhibited to visitors at the present day as the apartments which she occupied are really such, her quarters were very contracted. They consist of small apartments of an octagonal form, one over the other, with tortuous and narrow staircases in the solid wall to ascend from one to the other. The roof and the floors of the tower are gone, but the stairways, the capacious fireplaces, the loopholes, and the one window remain, enabling the visitor to reconstruct the dwelling in imagination, and even to fancy Mary herself there again, seated on the stone seat by the window, looking over the water at the distant hills, and sighing to be free. The Hamilton lords were not strong enough to attempt her rescue. The weight of influence and power throughout the country went gradually and irresistibly to the other scale. There were great debates among the authorities of government as to what should be done. The Hamilton lords made proposals in behalf of Mary which the government could not accede to. Other proposals were made by different parties in the councils of the insurgent nobles, some more and some less hard for the captive queen. The conclusion, however, finally was, to urge Mary to resign her crown in favour of her son, and to appoint Murray, when he should return, to act as regent till the prince should be of age. They accordingly sent commissioners to Loch Leven to propose these measures to the queen. There were 3 instruments of abdication prepared for her to sign. By one she resigned the crown in favour of her son. By the second she appointed Murray to be regent as soon as he should return from France. By the third she appointed commissioners to govern the country until Murray should return. They knew that Mary would be extremely unwilling to sign these papers, and yet that they must contrive in some way to obtain her signature without any open violence, for the signature to be of legal force must be, in some sense, her voluntary act. The 2 commissioners whom they sent to her were Melville and Lindsay. Melville was a thoughtful and reasonable man, who had long been in Mary's service, and who possessed a great share of her confidence and goodwill. Lindsay was, on the other hand, of an overbearing and violent temper, of very rude speech and demeanour, and was known to be unfriendly to the Queen. They hoped that Mary would be induced to sign the papers by Melville's gentle persuasions; if not, Lindsay was to see what he could do by denunciations and threats. When the 2 commissioners arrived at the castle, Melville alone went first into the presence of the Queen. He opened the subject to her in a gentle and respectful manner. He laid before her the distracted state of Scotland, the uncertain and vague suspicions floating in the public mind on the subject of Darnley's murder, and the irretrievable shade which had been thrown over her position by the unhappy marriage with Bothwell; and he urged her to consent to the proposed measures, as the only way now left to restore peace to the land. Mary heard him patiently, but replied that she could not consent to his proposal. By doing so, she should not only sacrifice her own rights, and degrade herself from the position she was entitled to occupy, but she should in some sense acknowledge herself guilty of the charges brought against her, and justify her enemies. Melville, finding that his efforts were in vain, called Lindsay in. He entered with a fierce and determined air. Mary was reminded of the terrible night when he and Ruthven broke into her little supper room at Holyrood in quest of Rizzio. She was agitated and alarmed. Lindsay assailed her with denunciations and threats of the most violent character. There ensued a scene of the most rough and ferocious passion on the one side, and of anguish, terror, and despair on the other, which is said to have made this day the most wretched of all the wretched days of Mary's life. Sometimes she sat pale, motionless, and almost stupefied. At others she was overwhelmed with sorrow and tears. She finally yielded, and taking the pen, she signed the papers. Lindsay and Melville took them, left the castle gate, entered their boat, and were rowed away to the shore. This was on the 25th of July, 1567, and 4 days afterward the young prince was crowned at Stirling. His title was James VI. Lindsay made oath at the coronation that he was a witness